Hello, I'm Lauren Davies and I'm a historian that's interested in the history of crime. In this video we're going to be looking at the suffragette movement of the early 20th century. We know that women were fighting for their rights long before the suffragette movement because we have the 16th century tract of Jane Anger and the seminal work of Mary Wollstonecraft, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. But it really was in the early days of the 20th century, leading up to the First World War, that we really see the urgency for women to gain the right to vote. Since 1905 and the first cries of militancy, the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, were leading the charge for civil disobedience. The WSPU was led by the likes of Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst. And though we know that Christabel led the charge during the height of the civil disobedience movement from France, in 1908 it is very clear that she was in London and very much part of the movement. We know this because the day after the rush on Parliament, which took place on the 13th of November 1908, she was in Bow Street Court, which is now a museum, facing charges of inciting violence, inciting breach of the peace and law breaking. Now, Christabel was a trained lawyer, but because of her sex, she wasn't allowed to practice. And though she argued valiantly against their charges, all three women, Flora Drummond, Christabel and Emmeline, were found guilty and fined. Unfortunately, as was customary for the suffragettes, they decided not to pay their fines and they were in prison. On her release in December 1908, Emmeline was greeted to a sea of women, around 200 women dressed in white, which is one of the key colours of the suffragette movement. After being greeted by her supporters, she was then taken to a breakfast for 350 people at the Savoy, where she was presented with a customary WSPU medal for valour. This medal was given to all suffragettes that were imprisoned and to those that faced hunger strike. With militancy came the changing relationship with the lawmakers. Unfortunately, the Liberal government didn't really give the police clear guidance on how they were supposed to deal with the women and were essentially told to deal with them how they saw fit. This really escalated during the period of the rush on Parliament on the 13th of November, and in the days after the rush, women collected testimony from those that were assaulted, raped and sexually assaulted. We do have key independent witness testimony which concerns the disabled suffragette Rosa May Billinghurst, who was led down a side road by police, assaulted, and the valves and wheels of a wheelchair were taken. It's unclear from documentation that exists if those police ever faced charges, but it's unlikely that they did. The violence was to such an extreme on the 13th of November that nearby Caxton Hall was turned into a first aid station, and women really were exhausted from their attempts to get into Parliament. And this is encapsulated by the words of Christabel's sister and Emmeline's second daughter, Sylvia. "We saw women go out and return exhausted, with black eyes, bleeding noses, bruises and dislocation. The cry went round, 'Be careful. They are dragging women down the side streets.' We knew this meant greater ill usage." In Pankhurst's testimony, we see that they were looking out for each other, that there was a real fear about being dragged away from the crowd of suffragettes and being beaten, or worse. Once incarcerated, the suffragette often went on hunger strike. Now, this was a reaction to the loss of liberties. They didn't see themselves as criminal prisoners, they saw themselves as political prisoners. Now, political prisoners were supposed to keep their own clothes and were supposed to be allowed writing implements, and this was something that was denied to the suffragettes. This caused them great distress because they were put in prison uniforms, which is something that they weren't used to. It was something of a culture shock. Again, we can see this as something that the government took on to control them or to try and scare them into behaving. There are a great number of accounts in the National Archives about the way that women were treated, and they are harrowing to read. Now, these accounts don't just come from the women themselves, they come from the prison doctors that looked after them and the wardresses that looked after them. This situation would have been something the wardresses themselves would have been quite shocked to see as well. Women of society coming in and resisting them, assaulting them. And again, in the archives, there are these incident reports which indicate what happened and the attacks on the wardresses. So even though we don't have a great deal of testimony from the wardresses themselves about how they felt or their opinions on the suffragette movement, we do see the violence that was enacted on them in attempts to get the women to eat. In the cases where the authorities did deal with the suffragettes through forcible feeding, we do get a sense that it was thought that it could cause and did cause the death of suffragettes. And this is particularly evident in the case of Mary Jane Clark, née Golden, who was the sister of Emmeline Pankhurst, who died Christmas 1910, shortly after being released from prison. And it's really in a letter to the editor of the Times after her sister's death that she really speaks about her frustration in regards to forcible feeding and suggests to him that she believes that her sister, though she died from a heart condition, she feels that this heart condition was exacerbated by the forcible feeding. The militant campaign was seen as necessary. The polite way hadn't worked for them. They had been rebuffed, they had been tricked in a way, and it's really the historian Fern Riddell that gives us pause for thought in explaining to us that if it hadn't been for the First World War, that the violence that we've seen in the rush on Parliament was starting to escalate, and that there was a very real possibility that the suffragettes would have started dealing with firearms.